Ruthless Compassion is a podcast that shows you how to become fiercely kind. I'm the host, Dr. Marcia Sirota, and in each episode, I get into it with experts and regular folks about the things that get in the way of what we want. Things like addiction and mental health, isolation and loneliness, difficult family and work relationships, and the importance of self-care. I want to help you overcome the obstacles to living your best life, and I want to inspire you to become a powerful kindness warrior. Alexandra Lange is the author of The Design of Childhood: How the Material World Shapes Independent Kids. Her writing has appeared in New York, The New York Times, Curbed, Dwell, The New Yorker, and many other magazines and design journals. She has authored and co-authored several previous books, including writing about architecture. Lange holds a Ph.D. in 20th-century architecture history from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, and she lives in Brooklyn with her family. Follow her at www.alexandralange.net and on Twitter at LangeAlexandra. Welcome, Alexandra Lange, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have you on today because the title of your book, The Design of Childhood, really intrigued me. And the subtitle is How the Material World Shapes Independent Kids. And, independent kids is a topic near and dear to my heart. So maybe we can start by talking about what got you to writing this book and what were you trying to say when you wrote it?
Sure. Well, the first and most obvious answer to why I wrote this book is because I had a child. My oldest is 10 now. And as a design critic, I became fascinated by all of the things that started coming into my home and into my life when I had children. Obviously, I had been through a lot of those things when I was a child, but most of us don't have a lot of, material memory of their childhood. And it was fascinating to me both what kinds of things people were recommending, what kind of things were on the market, and then kind of comparing that to the sorts of things that I began to remember having as a kid. Just even odd things like I remember my car seat when I was a child, and it was basically this plastic bucket with straps, whereas the car seats for my children were these huge upholstered things that I had to muscle in and out of the car. So just kind of the physical dealing with children and the stuff that comes with children was very fascinating to me, and I didn't feel like there was a lot of good writing about it.
So what kind of stuff do you think is, most significant for a child when they're growing up? Like, what are the things that they interact with in their material world that that has the most impact, you think?
Yeah. Well, in my book, I focus on things that have an architectural component or a spatial component. So I have a chapter on blocks, which I feel like is really the first physical action that most children are taking with another object. And then I talk about the home, schools, playgrounds, and finally the city. And I feel like blocks and toys are a really important way that children explore the world. At first, just from a seated position or even a lying down position on the rug in your house. And then they start to build their own structures, and then they start to encounter blocks and other built structures, outside the home, on the playground, and things like that. So I really see it as a progression in size and in developmental stage from something as simple as the block to exploring the city.
And so here we are in 2018, and we have so many different options for things that we can give children to play with. Obviously there are things that are going to help our children develop independently, intellectually, physically, and then there might be things that don't help. What's your thoughts on that?
I really like open-ended toys. I mean, that's why I focused on blocks and building toys, because there are a lot of things now with noises and lights and blinking signs, and your kids don't really need those things. They might be fun, and honestly, I understand everybody needs a break sometime. My children both had one of those aquarium bouncers that just sort of bubbled and played music, and they spend time in that. And my children also do use iPads, so I'm not an absolutist on no electronics or no noises. But I feel like the best toys and the longest lasting toys are ones that are built out of sturdy materials, are fun to look at, but then can go really in any direction, can be combined with other toys that you can use to create a space for dolls or action figures. And so that kind of toy, which is blocks, which is Legos, which is this great more recent toy called Zoob that I talk about in the book, those allow your child to set out his or her own play and don't dictate a storyline or dictate a limited set of operations just from the get-go.
And when a child has too much of that storyline dictated, what do you think happens to them?
Well, I think they get bored easily, and then some kids start to break things. That's something people talk about more in playgrounds, that if playgrounds are too boring, kids start to use the equipment in unorthodox ways. But I think that also happens with toys. They, try to get in the back to see if there's something more that could be done. Or they start, if something has flippers or something, they start just working it back and forth because they want more out of it. And the kind of toys that I think are best are things that are very solid in themselves. So it's obvious there's not another dimension to it. It's that the child has to bring their imagination and create that other dimension. I think most people with children feel like they're dealing with this tremendous inundation of stuff. And part of that is probably buying toys or having toys given to them that just have too limited a time frame in which they can be used and too limited a time in which they are fun.
Right. And, you mentioned the child's imagination. How important is it for the child's imagination to just run free?
It's of the most importance. If you talk to any teacher, they'll say the first educational lessons need to be child-led. The child has to participate in that education, has to want to know more, and education comes from playing with things like blocks and building toys, from seeing one day that you can stack 3 and the next day figuring out to stack 4. Like, these are the early lessons, and those have to be provoked by the child's own mind, or they are just passive recipients of grown-ups talking. It's sort of like the Charlie Brown cartoons where all the adults' voices are just like wah, 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 wah. The child has to want to play in order for the child to learn.
And if the child doesn't get to activate their imagination, what kind of problems do you think can arise?
I think that boredom, obviously, but boredom then manifests itself as, a lack of initiative, not wanting to go outside, not wanting to run around, kind of sluggishness in both like the physical and mental world of the child. I mean, most kids are pretty motivated to find something that interests them. So I don't think that's a huge problem, but you do have to make sure that there is enough. I think, a lot of schools have initiated summer reading programs, and public libraries have summer reading programs to bridge the gap in the summertime when some kids get bored. I'm also working on a piece right now about the history of toy libraries, because play provision is as important as a provision for reading. And historically, there have been public resources for kids to check out toys, to kind of get rid of the toys that are too young for them and move on to more. And I think all of those things have to be kind of factored into, what are we providing as a society for children so that they can move up and move on as they need to.
And, I'm starting to think about the difference between a child who is actively engaging their imagination and then a child who is passively experiencing a toy that has too many bells and whistles. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think it's just a matter of, what are they getting out of it? It's very easy to run through all the operations in a passive toy, and then it's like, what am I supposed to do? I'm just supposed to run them through again. It's like having a library with only one book. You can get out of it. You can get something out of it as you reread, but at a certain point, it just becomes this kind of mechanical operation. And that's not what play is, and that's not going to lead to more learning, and then that's not going to lead to finding the next thing in kind of a train of thought.
Right, exactly. I agree with you. Now, Your next sphere of play you were talking about was in the house, right? And the next material world that the child interacts with. How can a house be made to be supportive of the child becoming an independent thinker and actor?
Well, one of the things I talk about in the book is just kind of, to me, a key design object is the trip trap chair, which is this high chair designed in the 1970s by the Norwegian designer Peter Opsvik. And I feel like that is a great illustration of the way that a home and furniture can support a child's development. The major factors of the trip trap chair are, number one, the child can get in and out of it him or herself. It pulls up to the table, so it doesn't have one of those trays that you see on a lot of high chairs that means you have to lift the kid in and out. The child can climb up via a footrest onto his or her own seat and can get down. So they have an independence in accessing the table. The chair is also adjustable, so when your child is really small, you can bring him or her up to the level of adults at the table, and you can adjust it over time, so you don't have to keep buying, first a high chair and then a booster. I mean, you know how like Babies R Us are always trying to sell you another piece of furniture for the next year. And the trip trap, I bought one for my son when he was 1, and he's still using it, though now he often uses it as a step stool to get things on a high shelf. But it's really sturdy and it really is long lasting. So it's one of those things that's actually worth the money. And so I just feel like that's a great illustration because it talks about children, kind of being the captains of their own ship, being in control of their own bodies and kind of where they move in the house, and also an understanding that children change all the time and that furniture and the house need to accommodate that. Another thing I talk about in that chapter is storage, which is a huge issue for families with children. And from, the 1920s on, parenting magazines are talking about how children need open shelving and low shelving so that they can see their own toys and learn to put away their own toys. So again, it's this question of independence being kind of built into the furnishings and built into the way you set up your home.
You focus a lot on independence. So I want to ask you just outright, why do we need independent kids? Why is it so important that children are independent?
Well, I mean, the primary thing is it leads to independence of mind, which I think leads to more creative and productive adults. Because children who from a young age have been asked for their opinions, been allowed to have preferences, been taught to be responsible, are just going to be better able to deal both with what life throws at them and then to be creative and think kind of laterally about what they want to do with their lives and what they want to do in the world. There's also just the question of understanding geography and understanding the way the city works. And it's been proven that kids who are driven around in cars, which is largely a passive activity, don't really gain a good mental map of their cities. But kids who walk and kids who bike, every time they're doing one of those trips, that's actually putting a map into their heads and helping them understand how to get around. And so later, they can get themselves around. They'll be able, they'll understand how to read a map. All of these things are just really important life skills. And sometimes the way that, children's lives are structured today means the date at which they learn those life skills gets pushed back and back and back.
I agree with you. And I look at how kids are getting more and more problems with mental health in, grade school and high school. They're falling into tears. They're not coping. They're going to the guidance counselor and the school counselors and they just feel so overwhelmed. And it makes me wonder what kinds of things are happening earlier on in their lives that are contributing to the children feeling so overwhelmed and helpless in their lives, later on in school and in high school and even in university.
Yeah, I mean, I think we understand, especially as adults, that there's a mind-body connection. When we're stressed out, we know to take a walk or that we need to exercise, and that helps to balance things out. But I think kids who aren't taught to be in tune with their bodies and aren't given the option to say, oh, you know what, I need to go to a quieter place now. I need to take a walk now. Don't understand those things and may have more trouble, managing their anxiety, managing their relationships. So the sooner you can put those tools into kids' hands safely, I think the better off they're going to be.
I totally agree. So now after home, we have our kids in school. So what kinds of things need to be in place in schools for our children to be independent thinkers and actors?
Well, one thing that I talk about a lot in my chapter on schools is the design of the classroom. And I was really heartened to see, one of the kind of new learning modes that's in vogue now is something called project-based learning, which tries to get children out of a passive position of, listening to the teacher talk and then doing worksheets or doing a very specific exercise and trying to give them more control over at least part of their day and the topics that they study in school. So instead of being assigned a really specific essay topic, children will be assigned a longer-term project. They can pick the topic, they can figure out how to do the research, and then they can present it, maybe not necessarily as a written thing, but as a video or as a public presentation. And all the time that they're working on that project, they are choosing what kind of space is going to be best for that part of their study. As you know, some people work best in groups. Some people work best in a totally quiet, dark environment. And the classroom design for project-based learning takes that into account. And I would say usually there are basically three sizes of spaces, small, medium, and large, for individual work, small group work, and whole class work. And I think a classroom set up that way teaches children to know themselves and know how they're going to work the best. And it gives teachers the options of saying, are you really able to focus here in this big room while kids over there are doing a science project, or wouldn't you be better off going into this little booth? A lot of them kind of set up almost like restaurant booths and working with just one other person. And that is great knowledge to have, when you're in middle school, when you're in high school.
Yeah, it gives the children an opportunity, like you say, to know themselves, to know what works best for them.
Yeah, my son is 10 and he just went off to camp, and I know at the end of each day after school he likes to have some time to himself. So I talked to him before he went off to camp about, okay, after you've done all your activities for the day and before dinner, I'm sure there's going to be a quiet time. You need to figure out how you can make that time similar to the time you have at home, and just, kind of protect yourself, know that you need to run around a little, know that you need to read a book, and make sure you have that, because otherwise I felt like he was just going to feel overwhelmed. So, it was good to try to talk to him about the physical and emotional space that he makes in his everyday life and how to transplant that to another place.
And don't you find that when kids are able to make their own choices and find the right space for them, it gives them that sense of empowerment and autonomy and confidence?
Definitely. And the sooner you can give them that feeling, the better. And it's better for you as a parent because you're not following around after them, picking up everything, reminding them. That's not the healthiest relationship. And I think it makes everybody in a family feel better if people can take care of themselves at whatever level is developmentally appropriate.
I totally agree. Now, what about the playground? What needs to be put in place in the playground to help children be more independent in their lives?
Well, the first thing, and I've said this a lot, the first thing is I think children need to be able to access playgrounds on their own after a certain age. I live in Brooklyn, and I feel like the streets around my house, a lot of them are still too wide, and the cars are going too fast for me to let my son go independently to some of the good playgrounds. And so in a way, it doesn't matter what the equipment is if kids can't reach playgrounds safely. But that said, I do think that cities need to take a hard look at what kind of equipment they have in playgrounds, what age groups it's aimed at, because they're losing a lot of kids, I would say, at around age 8, because most of the equipment is meant for smaller kids. A lot of the equipment is coming from the same 2 or 3 catalogs, and so even if you go to a playground in a different neighborhood, it will basically have the same climbing structure. And that gets back to this question of boredom and mischief as a result of boredom, because cities need to provide kids with playgrounds that have enough challenge and enough risk to keep them them coming back for more and to keep them coming back to say, okay, you know what? It was too hard for me to get to the top of that climbing structure 3 months ago. Let me see if it's better now. I know kids who on just the playground near my house have spent weekend after weekend trying to get strong enough to go all the way across the monkey bars. One of my daughter's friends even got, calluses on her hands from like practicing the monkey bars. And the desire to have that kind of practice and the desire to accomplish that feat of getting across the monkey bars is really important. And we need that, not just for 7-year-olds, but for 12-year-olds and even 15-year-olds.
You're right, because that builds confidence, that builds a sense of competence and capacity, and then that child can take that into school where they would be less likely to get overwhelmed and to feel frustrated by challenges, because they could take that same physical capacity and translate it into a confidence around their emotional and intellectual capacity, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some kids are going to embrace physical challenges before they would embrace an intellectual challenge. Some kids are the other way around. But, however you are, you need to feel comfortable in both of those spheres. And you can take confidence from one sphere into the other sphere. And I think often people see recreation as just recreation, but in fact, it has an incredible emotional and intellectual connection, and which is as important as school-based learning.
Do you think that sitting around passively on our computers or on our tablets is making children less confident and less capable than if they were out in the world playing and actively engaging in playgrounds and in the city?
Well, I don't think that all computer and tablet use is passive. So I just want to make that distinction. But I do think there needs to be a balance. And I feel like the boringness of playgrounds is probably driving a lot of kids, especially teenagers, to more use of tablets, to more entry into online communities when they need to also have offline communities. But they just don't feel like there's that option. Either their streets aren't safe enough, or they don't have a safe playground or even, kind of shopping mall to go to hang out with friends. And so they end up hanging out with friends online, which is still, a social structure, and online communities can be very positive, but that doesn't have that physical aspect. They're not spending time outdoors, and they're not making roots in their own community.
Exactly. So let's get to the city part of your ideas. So what does a city need to help kids grow up to be independent in thought and in action?
Well, I talk in the book about a number of older urban planned communities that tried to solve this problem of how to design a family-friendly community. And one of the ones that a lot of people in urban planning circles already know about is this place called Radburn, New Jersey. And in Radburn, New Jersey, the houses have very small private yards, and basically all the space that would have been a private yard in a more typical suburb have been thrown together so that there are these big lawns that the houses all back onto and are all connected to without crossing any road. All of the cars are parked in the back of the house, and the house then fronts onto this big common ground. And obviously that's not possible in some denser cities. It's very hard to retrofit. But some version of that, some version of connected green space that can allow a child to go from their home to a playground, to their school, even to, a small shop, so that, there's something called the popsicle test, like can they walk to buy a popsicle? That trying to create some version of that is, I think, really important going forward in talking about city planning, to keep people in dense communities and allow children to move freely around their own world.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's very hard for me to imagine a place that has that these days.
It is hard, but I do feel like people are talking about it. In the book, I talk about Toronto, which recently created these family-friendly planning guidelines that they're hoping developers will adopt. And, those guidelines talk about everything from, safe routes to school to the design of apartments with more storage. So they're very thorough. Obviously, it depends on new construction to adopt those, but I guess I was heartened to see that that was even part of a citywide discussion as a priority. More recently, Detroit just announced that architects had been hired to replan a neighborhood there to make it more family friendly. And I think it'll be really interesting, because that's an existing, already built neighborhood, to see how they retrofit it. There's a lot of empty space on our streets. There's a lot of space that's been given over to cars that doesn't necessarily have to stay in the car world. And I think that's where we're going to find space that we didn't realize we had, that maybe can be more family friendly, more pedestrian friendly, more bike friendly, and the rest of it.
And how do you foresee, the future? If we do start, getting our heads around this and start giving children more opportunity with their toys at school, in the playground, in their city, at home, what do you think is likely to happen if we are more responsive to shaping independent kids? What do you think is going to be the outcome to that?
Well, my hope would be that kind of all parts of the family find themselves in a better community and spending more time outside, and honestly with more time on their hands. I mean, I think one of the penalties of not being able to have independent kids is that parents, most of whom, are into, both parents working, have to spend so much more time either supervising their children or shuttling them to activities than they did in the past. And that means that adults have less time to spend outdoors, to work on their own projects, to have leisure between kind of their work life and their home life. And I think it would create a better balance in families' lives where everybody can pursue what they want to do in parallel, but, kind of the children's needs don't have to be paramount and aren't taking up so much time that can't be used for any other purpose.
I just read a really interesting article by a young father who was saying that he was not alone among his friends of all not being able to spend time with their friends and feeling very lonely because the only time they had was work time and spouse time and kid time, and they couldn't spend any time with their friends because they had so much to do with their children. Like you say, the shuttling them around, the helping them with different things. So if this were a possibility, then I could imagine that this young guy he and his friends are feeling so lonely, they could actually make time during the week to play some sports or do some fun things and feel that sense of connection. And I think that's very good for everybody's mental health, right? The father will feel more happy and fulfilled, and that will pass on to the family. So this is a real win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone can be mentally and physically more healthy. Why does the parent have to sit on a bench at a playground, next to a field where people are playing a game? Why couldn't the parent be playing a game while the child is playing on a playground? I mean, there are all these kind of ways that contemporary family life has been structured, and it hasn't been like that for very long, and it doesn't have to be that way. And if we start to analyze our physical space, I think we can figure out ways to make it, not that way, because I think that family life in America today is really taxing all up and down the income scale. American society, puts a lot on the private sector, puts a lot on the individual family, and that's just becoming increasingly difficult, and that's why we're seeing the birth rate decrease in the U.S.
Right, because if it's too exhausting and overwhelming to have 3 children, then maybe you're just going to have one.
Right. I think that women generally drive the child rearing decisions, and I think women are deciding that, if I want to have a career, one child is the way to go.
Yeah, for sure. So to sum up, I was just wondering, first of all, where can people find you if they're looking to read more about the design of childhood or your thoughts?
I have a website, alexandralange.net, and I can also be found on Twitter and Instagram at @LangeAlexandra, just my name in reverse.
That's wonderful. And do you have any projects that are on the go right now?
Well, I write frequently for Curbed. I'm the architecture critic there. And I'll be lecturing in several cities this fall about the book, including Chicago and Milwaukee in October and New Canaan, Connecticut in September. And all the events details are available on my website.
Fantastic. And to wrap up, finally, what kind of a call to action could you give our listeners today?
I think I would say to treat your children with respect and think about what you can do in their lives to help give them the kind of independence that I've been talking about. To think about the toys that you have and which ones they play with for hours, which ones can connect to each other, and try to highlight those in your home and clean out some of the dross. Think about small challenges that you can have them do in the neighborhood. Can they go to the corner store alone? Try it out, because I do think that these kinds of things will tremendously impact their confidence and will help you to understand what are their limits and what kinds of changes you be able to advocate for in your immediate neighborhood or at your school.
That's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the Ruthless Compassion podcast today, and you've really given us a lot of interesting thoughts to consider.
Great. Thank you so much.
All the best.
Okay. Bye.
That was the fascinating Alexandra Lange, and I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. If you like this podcast, please review it on iTunes, and you can sign up for my free monthly wellness newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll also learn about my new online courses.